Welcome to the Skull Resin Figurine step-by-step video. You can see here I'm using a water-based prep cleaner. Basically it's totally thinned out with water. I clean up that resin figurine as best as I can. You need to make sure you get in all the little areas, and the Scotch-Brite will just rough up the surface so that the paint sticks nicely to it, and this just takes off any grime before painting. So once you've done that all over your figurine, you make sure you rinse it off with water. It needs to be completely rinsed off and dried before you start painting. Here I've just based the whole figurine with white House of Colour urethane paint, thinned out 1:1, and I've just added raw umber and Createx Wicked Black, a few drops, and mixed that up with a couple of drops of water just to make a nice thin acrylic brown base, just a dirty brown to use to sort of, well, dirty up the skull a little bit. So adding a few more drops of that Wicked Black, I start in the eye sockets and just get a bit of darker, all the darker areas I just paint them in with the brush, and we're going to add dry brushing and airbrushing to the figurine a bit later. So as you can see, this mix is extremely thin. So I apply it first and it sits in all the grooves, and then with the other brush I'll remove all that excess paint, and then that'll expose the base colour, which is your white, so that'll show through. So this basically will just give the skull that stained look so that it's not a bright white skull. So you just pretty much grab your brush and keep working in that raw umber with the black mix. So you can see it sits nicely in the grooves on this pile of skulls. So you can see the main skull sitting on the stack of little skulls. So we just continue to work all of the areas, all the real dark areas at the moment, but we really need to get this brown mix over the whole skull so it'll stain the actual skull like I mentioned earlier. I've just added a few more drops of that Wicked Black. So you can use these colours and mix them in with other acrylics. For this purpose it's not really that crucial, so I'm just using anything and it'll be perfect for 2-pack clear. So you can see here I'm spreading it quite heavily over the skull, and now using a rag, so not just a dry brush, I use a rag. It's a bit more uneven when it spreads and dries the paint, and you really get that look of a stained skull. So you can see working in pretty much over the whole thing just randomly, and then brushing it out with just with water so it sits nicely in all the cracks and all the pits of the skull. So working right around, keeping it nice and wet, and then just wiping off the excess. So it's a great way to do this. Combining this with airbrushing, you're going to get a more realistic effect, rather than just trying to airbrush everything, especially trying to get that sort of real uneven texture. The brush does it really nicely in probably half the time with the airbrush. So you can still see now I'm working in more and more detail, so you can do numerous layers as well. So you can let a section dry and then just come back to it. And I'm just going back in with the rag and just pulling out any of that excess paint. So you can see I'm still working in all that detail. So the raw umber mix that I made up with the Wicked Black, as you can see, it's extremely thin. So you're constantly switching between the brushes. So you can see one cup has water in it, so I keep dipping the brush in there. Once I've applied the raw umber mix, then I'll use my other brush and wet it up with a lot of water, and then just brush it all out, and then come in with the rag and basically wipe off all the excess, and everything else will just stay in the cracks as mentioned earlier. So you can see it's starting to take a bit of shape now, more details happening within the within the skull pile on the bottom. So I just work my way around until I fill all those areas. So take your time, make sure you get it in all the correct spots. If it's a little bit uneven, it won't matter, because everything that is bone can look a little bit uneven. It's not going to make a difference. It's going to make it look a bit more realistic. So just fill in that whole area. Do section by section, because you don't want things to dry. In using this method, you want to keep the part that you're painting wet enough so that you've got time to wipe it all off. You don't want it to totally dry on the surface. So you can see I'm just working that rag and just really getting in there and rubbing off all of those spots to create the highlights. Have a good look at it, make sure you're happy. Go back in and fix any spots. And now I'm just working in that teeth area. So exactly the same thing. You can actually brush quite heavily in the deeper cracks if there's not enough paint going in there. So if you need to darken your mix as well, just keep adding a bit more black. So just work on the eye sockets now. It'll take a while for them to build up with paint, but even a little bit, it'll still show up nicely under the airbrushed areas once I start painting them. And it'll give it a more uneven look because the airbrush is extremely soft and smooth. So to make it look a bit more realistic, you can actually brush in the darker areas and it will still show. So we're just working around the back of the skull where the heaviest shadows will be. Just keep checking over what you're doing. Brush into the cracks. Again, more and more layers will start to give you more and more depth. So, okay, you can see now that I've switched to my airbrush. So using my CMC Micron by Iwata, and I've got House of Color White, so just a urethane based paint, the same paint that I used to base up the actual resin figurine. I'm just hitting all the highlight areas and just doing a bit of a spray over, general sort of clouding effect over the whole skull area. But on the jawbone and the teeth, I'll go a bit brighter, and any of the higher highlights. So just go in with the airbrush and gradually build your colour. So even on the pile of skulls, I'm just hitting the cranium of the skulls with the white just to really brighten it up, and just adding some highlights to their teeth. Don't worry too much about overspray because you're going to come back in with the black, which is what we're doing now. So I've just got a thinned out black base coat, and I'm just working in all the dark areas. So again, working in the darkest spot and feathering out, and still allowing some of my brush strokes to show through. And now I'm going to start adding more and more detail. So by detailing and being up close with the airbrush and blending out, because the paint's so thin, you can still see my effect that I've got from using the brush. Now just carefully working in around the teeth area and on that pile of skulls. So just going to set that rag up there to make it a bit easier to work on, and just really get some detail in these smaller skulls on the pile there that sits underneath your main skull. So you can spend as long as you like on this part of it. You could even add some other colors into it. So if you wanted for argument's sake, you wanted to change the color of the skulls on the base to say red, you could add a candy red and then work in all your detail on top of that. So don't feel that you have to be limited. So each skull's overlapping and sitting on top of the other, so I'm just working that black in between and then doing their eye sockets, their nose socket, and also detailing the teeth. So just to continue working around. It's a good idea to wear gloves so that you keep it nice and clean, so that later on when this gets clear coated, it's not contaminated in any way. These can actually be used as a gear knob for a car, so you can they come as blanks and you can drill out the base of them to suit. So just freehanding those cracks in and just running some real uneven textures and blending some shadows out, and just work it slowly until you're happy with the way it's looking. So don't overkill it, less is more. You can always add more as you go, so it's a lot easier to add than to go backwards and try and make things lighter. So again, just shading as much as possible, getting in as much detail. And it's starting to come to shape now. Always darker under the jawbone. So just from a distance blending that in, and now I'm just checking over it. Make sure I'm totally happy with it. And here you go. You can see the completed resin figurine all painted up. So you can really see all of that detail that dry brushing has created mixed with the airbrushing. So even the cracks, everything's been airbrushed. So this is shown before clear. So I hope you enjoyed it.